He stopped him right in the middle of the courtroom, ignoring the file in his hands, ignoring the bar card he'd already shown, and declared loud enough for everyone to hear, "You don't belong here." Gasps rippled through the benches as the officer slapped on handcuffs, dragging the man toward the exit. While the judge sat frozen and attorneys who knew better stayed silent. But what no one in that room realized was that the man being humiliated in chains wasn't just another lawyer. He was the Chief Justice himself. Before I show you how the reveal shook that courthouse to its core, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell icon. Because this story, it only gets heavier from here. Now let's get into it. The courthouse was already alive by 8:30 in the morning. Inside the marble lobby, footsteps echoed against polished floors. Clerks hurried past with armfuls of files, and the security scanners beeped rhythmically as lawyers shuffled through with their briefcases. Outside, the early sun slanted through tall windows, painting strips of light across the waiting benches. It was an ordinary day in the eyes of most who walked in. Routine hearings, routine motions, routine disputes. But for one man, this morning carried a quiet weight. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that bore no designer flash, only an understated authority. In his hand was a slim leather folder, scuffed at the edges from years of use. His steps were measured, not hurried like the younger attorneys darting around him. He moved with the calm of someone who had walked into courtrooms thousands of times before, but without the arrogance many seasoned lawyers carried. "Good morning, Mr. Daniels," the janitor at the entrance said, recognizing him with a small nod. "Good morning, Henry," he replied warmly, adjusting his glasses. "Busy day?" "As always," the janitor chuckled, pushing his mop bucket aside. The man smiled and continued inside. To most eyes, he was just another attorney arriving early to prepare. His name, at least the one he used for introductions here, was James Daniels. Few in this courthouse had reason to suspect that behind that unassuming name stood the Chief Justice himself, choosing today, as he sometimes did, to sit quietly in a courtroom without robes or retinues, to watch and to listen. At the clerk's desk, he set down his folder gently. "I believe I'm on the docket for case review this morning," he said. The young clerk glanced at him, half distracted by her computer. "Name?" "Daniels," she typed briskly, barely looking up. "Yes, courtroom 3. Proceedings start in 20 minutes. "Thank you," he said with a polite nod. If she had looked closer, she might have noticed the gravity in his tone, the discipline in his bearing. But like everyone else this morning, she saw only what she expected to see, another lawyer, unremarkable in the endless line of them. As he walked toward the courtroom, he paused briefly at the bulletin board where announcements were pinned. Another lawyer, older and heavy-set, was fumbling to tack up a notice. Daniel stepped forward, holding it steady so the man could pin it straight. "Appreciate that," the man said, slightly out of breath. "Not at all." "We all need a hand sometimes," Daniels replied, before moving on. Inside courtroom 3, the atmosphere was quieter, solemn in its stillness, before the storm of voices to come. Benches creaked as early arrivers settled in. A stenographer adjusted her machine. Daniels chose a seat halfway down, neither at the front to draw attention nor at the back to appear hidden. He opened his folder, scanning the notes he had written in tidy, compact script. The sound of a door opening behind him drew a few glances. A uniformed officer stepped in, tall, broad-shouldered, his belt heavy with cuffs and baton. His eyes swept the room like a guard dog searching for intruders. Daniels barely lifted his head, but he felt the man's gaze linger a second too long on him. It was nothing, he thought. Just another day in court. Yet, as the officer's footsteps grew louder behind him, there was a faint prickle in the air, something that suggested this would not remain an ordinary morning for very long. The officer's boots struck the wooden floor with a deliberate heaviness, as if every step were meant to announce authority. His badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, his jaw tight, eyes scanning the benches with suspicion. He was one of those men who seemed to carry his uniform like armor, more than a duty. It was a weapon. Daniels kept his eyes on the notes before him, reading over his carefully drafted arguments. But he didn't have to look up to feel the stare that was fixed on him. After a long pause, the officer stopped directly at his row. "You," the officer said sharply, "let me see some ID." The words cut through the murmurs of the courtroom. Several heads turned toward Daniels, who slowly raised his eyes, calm but puzzled. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," the officer snapped. "This section's reserved for attorneys. ID dash now." Daniels blinked once, quietly closed his folder, and reached into his breast pocket. He produced his bar card, laminated and clearly marked, and held it out. "Here you go, officer." The man snatched it, with more force than necessary, giving it only the quickest glance. His lip curled. "Looks like you had this printed at a copy shop." A small ripple of laughter spread among a couple of spectators in the back row. Uncertain and uneasy, Daniels did not flinch. His voice remained steady. "That's an official card issued by the Bar Association. You're welcome to verify it with the clerk." But the officer wasn't interested in verification. He leaned closer, his voice dropping into a low sneer. "I've been working courthouse security 10 years. I know who belongs and who doesn't. And you," his eyes raked Daniels from head to toe, "don't." Daniels studied him for a beat, his expression unreadable. "You're mistaken," he said quietly. "I am counsel, and I have business before the court this morning." The officer's nostrils flared. He straightened up, puffing his chest. "Don't get smart with me. You step out of line. I'll have you out of this building before you can blink." From the bench nearby, another lawyer leaned over. "He's fine, officer. He's here all the time." But the cop silenced him with a glare. "Stay out of this." The tension in the room thickened. Some spectators avoided looking at either man, while others pretended to fuss with their phones, not wanting to get involved. Daniels, however, simply held the officer's gaze without aggression, only an unsettling steadiness that seemed to unnerve the man more than defiance would have. "I'll be here until my case is called," Daniel said at last, his tone firm but respectful. "If you have further concerns, I suggest you take them up with the presiding judge." The officer stared a moment longer, then tossed the ID back onto Daniels's folder. "Don't think you're fooling anyone," he muttered, turning on his heel and stomping toward the door. A few seconds of silence followed before the murmurs returned. Daniels reopened his folder, resuming his notes as though nothing had happened. But the air in the courtroom was no longer calm. A storm had been seeded, one that was waiting for the smallest spark to erupt. From his seat, Daniels exhaled quietly. Encounters like these were not new to him, yet something in the officer's manner, the hostility that went beyond protocol, told him this morning would not end with mere words. Courtroom 3 filled steadily as the clock struck 9. The low chatter of attorneys greeting one another mixed with the squeak of benches and the flutter of files being opened. At the front, the bailiff called for order, and moments later, the side door swung open. Judge Morrison entered briskly, robes flowing, spectacles perched low on his nose. He took his seat with practiced gravity. "All rise," the bailiff intoned. Everyone stood. Daniels rose with them, smoothing his suit jacket. His folder rested neatly on the bench before him, his notes aligned with quiet precision. "You may be seated," the judge said, and the shuffle of bodies resettling filled the room. The first matter was called, a routine hearing about property boundaries. Attorneys at the front table droned through their arguments, citing maps and deeds. The judge scribbled notes. The crowd shifted with mild boredom, but Daniels felt the heat of eyes on him long before he saw the source. From the side wall, the officer stood, arms crossed, gaze locked like a hawk on its prey. Every movement Daniels made, whether adjusting his glasses or jotting a note, was tracked with suspicion. It wasn't long before others noticed, too. A clerk whispered uneasily to another, and even one of the younger lawyers leaned back to glance nervously at the officer's unyielding stare. Daniels ignored it. He kept his posture upright, attention fixed on the proceedings. But when the second case was called, the lawyer at the plaintiff's table, a nervous junior, fumbled with his notes. Daniels, who had mentored more than a few younger attorneys over the years, leaned slightly forward and whispered a quiet reminder. "Start with the statute reference. Section 12, subsection B." The young lawyer shot him a grateful look, straightened, and found his footing. His voice steadied as he opened with the statute, earning a nod from the judge. That small kindness should have passed unnoticed, but the officer pounced. "You!" he barked suddenly, pointing straight at Daniels. The courtroom fell into a hush. "What are you doing interfering with these proceedings?" Daniels blinked, caught mid-sentence in his own notes. He turned calmly toward the officer. "I wasn't interfering. I was offering a word of guidance. That's entirely permissible." "Permissible?" The officer's voice thundered, drawing startled gasps. "You're not even supposed to be here. You're sitting there, pretending to be a lawyer, whispering to people, and you think that's permissible?" Judge Morrison looked up sharply. "Officer, what's the issue here?" The officer gestured wildly. "This man doesn't belong. He's been giving me trouble since he walked in. Fake ID, fake credentials. He's a fraud sitting in this courtroom." A wave of murmurs rippled across the benches. Several attorneys looked at each other in disbelief, some whispering, others avoiding eye contact entirely. Daniels rose slowly to his feet. His voice was even, resonant, but not raised. "Your Honor, I have been admitted to the bar for many years. My identification was shown to this officer earlier, but he refuses to accept it. I am here properly as counsel of record." The judge's brows knitted. "Do you have proof?" Daniels lifted his folder. "It's all here. My bar card, my case file, and the motion I'm scheduled to present today." But the officer wouldn't back down. He strode forward, boots pounding, and planted himself at the edge of Daniels' row. "He's lying! I know his type. Slick words, fancy papers, none of it real. You give him 1 inch, he'll poison these proceedings. I'm telling you, Judge, this man doesn't belong here." The judge hesitated. Daniels could see it. An old reflex. The easy weight of an officer's word tipping the balance. Morrison sighed, leaning back in his chair. Mr. Daniels, perhaps you should step outside until we can sort this matter. With respect, Your Honor, Daniels interjected, voice firm now. I have every right to be here. I will not step aside simply because an officer refuses to see what is plain fact. The tension snapped like a taut wire. The officer's face reddened, his hand twitching near the cuffs at his belt. And in that moment, it was clear to everyone in the room. The fragile line between courtroom decorum and outright confrontation had just been crossed. The courtroom was frozen in a breathless silence, every eye flicking between the officer's squared shoulders and Daniels's composed face. The judge shifted uneasily in his chair, pen tapping against the wooden bench. Officer, Judge Morrison said cautiously, let's not escalate this unnecessarily. If Mr. Daniels has documents, we can review them. But the officer cut him off, voice booming. I'm not waiting for paperwork. This man's a fraud, and I'm putting an end to it right now. Before anyone could respond, the officer lunged forward. His hand clamped down on Daniel's shoulder with rough force. The suddenness of the move sent a ripple of shock through the room. Papers fluttered. Benches squeaked. A woman gasped loudly in the gallery. Daniels did not resist. He merely closed his folder, set it neatly on the bench, and spoke in that same calm tone that seemed almost at odds with the chaos unfolding. Officer, this is a grave mistake. I am here lawfully, and you have no grounds to place me under arrest. You think you can lecture me? The officer barked, jerking him to his feet. The metallic clink of handcuffs snapped through the room like a whip. Gasps echoed. The young lawyer, whom Daniels had quietly guided earlier, half rose from his seat. He's telling the truth. He's... Sit down, the officer roared, silencing him with a glare. Judge Morrison lifted a hand, but his voice lacked conviction. Perhaps we should... But the officer was already securing one cuff around Daniel's wrist, his face twisted in triumph. You're under arrest for impersonating an attorney and obstructing court proceedings, he declared loudly, as though rehearsing for an audience. The other cuff clicked shut, binding Daniel's hands behind his back. For a moment, the room erupted into a chorus of whispers and mutters. Some attorneys exchanged incredulous looks. Others shook their heads, unwilling to interfere. One elderly woman in the gallery clutched her purse tightly, whispering, Lord, have mercy. Through it all, Daniel stood straight, his dignity intact even as the steel bit into his wrists. He turned his head slightly toward the officer, his voice steady and low. You are overstepping, sir. This is unlawful restraint. Save it, the officer sneered, giving him a shove toward the aisle. You'll be lucky if you see the light of day after this. The humiliation was sharp, deliberate. He paraded Daniels past the crowded benches, every step meant to underscore his supposed victory. Murmurs followed like shadows. Isn't he that attorney from last month's case? Someone whispered. I thought so too. Why would he fake it? Another voice, quieter but cutting. Maybe the officer just doesn't like the look of him. At the back of the courtroom, the bailiff shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Even Judge Morrison, seated high above the spectacle, simply cleared his throat and mumbled, Proceed with order, please. Let's continue. Continue? With a man in cuffs being dragged out in front of everyone. But that was the cruel truth of courtrooms in power. The machinery rolled on, even when injustice unfolded in plain sight. Daniels did not shout. He did not beg. His silence carried a weight heavier than the officer's barked commands. Each step toward the side door echoed like a drumbeat, drawing the eyes of every spectator who would remember this scene long after the hearing was forgotten. Just before the door closed behind them, Daniel spoke once more, his voice calm but edged with warning. "You may believe you've won a battle, officer. But the war you've started today will not end in your favor." The officer laughed harshly, shoving him through the door. "We'll see about that." The door slammed shut. Inside the courtroom, the whispers swelled into open conversation. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others nodded nervously as though agreeing with the officer by default. But beneath it all, there was an unspoken tension. Everyone felt, in some corner of their conscience, that something had gone terribly wrong. And in the dim hallway beyond, as the officer marched Daniels toward the holding area, that wrongness was about to take on a form no one inside courtroom 3 could yet imagine. The holding corridor behind the courtroom was narrow, its white walls scuffed and stained from years of boots and handcuffs scraping past. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glare that made every shadow look meaner than it was. The officer pushed Daniels forward with a hand between his shoulder blades, steering him toward a small processing room at the end. "Move it!" he barked. "You've wasted enough of everyone's time in there." Daniels walked calmly, his hands cuffed, his posture still upright despite the indignity. He did not shuffle or stumble the way most men did when dragged in restraints. He carried himself with the same measured composure as when he had first entered the courthouse, and that, more than anything, seemed to infuriate the officer further. Inside the processing room, a metal chair sat bolted to the floor beside a scuffed desk. The officer shoved Daniels down into the seat, the cuffs clanging against the backrest. "You think you're clever, huh?" he sneered, circling him like a predator. "Waltzing in here with your cheap suit and your fake bar card. Did you honestly think you'd get away with it?" Daniels looked up at him steadily. "I thought the law was applied by evidence, not assumption. You've provided none of the former." The officer's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Spare me the courtroom speeches." "You're not fooling anyone. I've seen guys like you before, smooth talkers, conmen, liars, people who think if they wear the right clothes and speak fancy, they can be anything they want. But not on my watch." He leaned in close, his breath hot with hostility. "You know what gave you away? The way you carry yourself. Real lawyers don't sit so smug. You walked in like you owned the place, and I wasn't about to let that slide." Daniel's reply was quiet, but it carried a weight that cut through the officer's bluster. "Perhaps what you saw wasn't smugness. Perhaps it was confidence. The confidence of a man who has earned his place in that courtroom many times over." The officer slammed a palm down on the desk, rattling a stack of papers. "Like, don't play with me. You're nothing, a fraud in a suit, and now you're going to sit here until someone comes to haul you off properly." For the first time, Daniels allowed the faintest trace of a smile. It wasn't mocking, but it unsettled the officer all the same. "You are making a grave mistake, officer, one that will not remain hidden behind these walls." The officer scoffed, though a flicker of unease darted across his face. "Yeah? Who's gonna save you? Some hotshot lawyer friend of yours? Don't count on it. Out there, nobody's speaking up for you. They're glad to see me put you in your place." He paced, restless, as if needing to burn off the energy of his own anger. "Men like you, You walk in here thinking you're above the rules. Not today. Today, you met me. Daniels said nothing further. He sat in the metal chair, wrists bound, his calm silence louder than any argument. The officer mistook it for defeat, but it was something else entirely. The patience of a man who knew the balance of power was only temporary. That truth had a way of forcing its way into the open. Minutes ticked by, the buzzing lights filling the silence. Then, faintly at first, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hall. More than one set. Voices followed, firm, commanding, nothing like the officer's bark. Daniel's eyes flicked toward the door. He didn't speak, but for the first time that morning, the faintest glimmer of change stirred in the air. The moment of reckoning was drawing close. The door burst open with a metallic clang, startling the officer mid-stride. Two senior courthouse officials stepped in first, a deputy marshal in a dark suit and the courthouse administrator, her face pale with alarm. Behind them came Judge Morrison himself, robes hastily gathered as though he had left his bench in a hurry. "What is going on here?" the administrator demanded, eyes darting from the officer to the man in cuffs. The officer straightened, puffing his chest. "I've apprehended an imposter." He was posing as an attorney and disrupting proceedings. Judge Morrison's gaze flicked to Daniels, then to the cuffs, biting into his wrists. For a fleeting moment, shame crossed his features, though he quickly masked it. "Is this true, Mr. Daniels? Do you have proof of who you are?" Daniels raised his bound hand slightly, the cuffs clinking. His voice was calm, measured. "I had already presented my bar credentials. They were dismissed as false. My case file sits on the bench in courtroom 3, untouched." The deputy marshal stepped forward, frowning. "Officer, did you verify his ID with the clerk's office?" "I didn't need to," the officer snapped. "I know a fraud when I see one. This man doesn't belong here." The administrator's lips thinned. "That's not procedure." "You know better." But the officer waved her off, his tone defensive, heated. "Look at him. He strolls in like he owns the place, whispers to attorneys, challenges authority. What more do you need to see? He's a pretender." Daniels finally rose to his feet, the chain between the cuffs rattling softly. He looked not at the officer, but at Judge Morrison, his gaze steady. "Your Honor, would you kindly tell this man my full name?" The judge froze, caught like a man who had stepped into a snare. He hesitated, his eyes lowering as though the very air had grown heavy. For a long moment, he said nothing. Daniel's voice cut through the silence, firmer now. "Speak it." The judge cleared his throat, his voice strained. "This is Chief Justice James Daniels." The words dropped into the room like thunder. The officer blinked, his mouth opening, then snapping shut, his face drained of color, then flushed red in quick succession. "What?" he croaked, as though he hadn't heard correctly. The administrator turned on him sharply. "You put the Chief Justice of this state in handcuffs?" Gasps rippled from the hall outside as curious clerks and attorneys crowded near the open door, words spreading like wildfire. The Chief Justice, the man they had just watched, dragged out in chains. Daniels lifted his wrists slightly. "Would someone kindly remove these?" The deputy marshal moved quickly, keys jingling as he unlocked the cuffs. The steel fell away with a sharp click, leaving faint red marks on his wrists. Daniels rubbed them lightly, not in pain, but as if brushing away an insult. The officer stammered, words tumbling out in desperation. I didn't know. He never said, no one told me. Daniels turned to him slowly. His eyes were calm, but the weight behind them was crushing. I did not need to say. It is not my duty to parade my title before you. I identified myself as counsel, presented credentials, and followed procedure. You chose not to see. You saw only what you wanted to see. The officer's mouth opened again, but no words came. His earlier bravado had shriveled to nothing. Daniel stepped closer, his voice lowering though every word carried. Tell me, officer, when you looked at me, did you see a lawyer? Or did you see only your own prejudice staring back at you? The silence that followed was unbearable. Even Judge Morrison shifted uncomfortably, his spectacles sliding down his nose. No one spoke. The weight of the truth was too heavy. Finally, Daniels turned from the officer to the gathering at the doorway. The law is not a matter of uniforms or assumptions. It is not the property of those who shout the loudest. It is a shield for all. And today that shield was torn away before your very eyes. The words lingered in the air, neither sermon nor speech, but a simple, devastating statement of fact. The officer stood frozen, his career unraveling in the silence. The administrator shook her head, signaling the deputy marshal. Escort him out. Effective immediately, he suspended pending review. The officer tried to protest, but his voice was swallowed by the murmurs of shock and shame spreading through the courthouse. He was led away, his heavy boots dragging now, no longer echoing with authority. Daniel stood in the center of the room, wrists free once more, the air around him charged. He adjusted his glasses, gathered the dignity that had never truly left him, and walked past the stunned crowd without another word. The man they had cuffed, mocked, and dismissed had revealed himself. And in that revelation, the balance of power in the courthouse shifted forever. The courthouse administrator's order rang with finality. Escort him out. The deputy marshal stepped forward, gripping the officer by the arm. This time, there was no swagger, no barked commands. The same hallway that had echoed with his boots minutes ago now swallowed the dull shuffle of a man suddenly stripped of authority. Wait! This isn't fair, the officer sputtered, yanking against the marshal's grip. I was doing my job. He didn't identify himself. How was I supposed to know? But no one moved to defend him. Attorneys who had once averted their eyes now stared openly, some with disbelief, others with a quiet satisfaction that justice, however delayed, had arrived. Chief Justice Daniels did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His calm words cut sharper than any gavel. You were supposed to follow procedure. Instead, you followed your prejudice. That is not a job done. It is a duty abandoned. The officer's protests wilted as he was pulled toward the corridor, his voice growing smaller with each step. I didn't mean it was just a mistake. The door shut behind him, silencing the excuses. A hush lingered. Then, Judge Morrison cleared his throat, his voice strained with embarrassment. Chief Justice, if I had realized... Daniels turned to him, expression unreadable. It is not your failure to recognize me that concerns me, Your Honor. It is your failure to question what was plainly before your eyes. When an officer accused without proof, you allowed his word to outweigh evidence. That is not justice. It is deference. The judge swallowed hard, unable to meet his gaze. Daniel stepped forward, addressing not only the bench but the crowded doorway where clerks and attorneys craned to listen. His voice carried with the quiet authority of a man who did not need to shout. Let this be clear. The courtroom is not the officer's domain, nor the judge's alone. It belongs to the law, and the law belongs to the people. Any man or woman who enters these halls is to be judged by evidence and right, not by suspicion and prejudice. A murmur of assent rippled through the crowd. Even those who had stayed silent during the confrontation now nodded, the weight of his words settling deep. The administrator clasped her hands, her voice low but firm. Chief Justice will convene an immediate inquiry into the officer's conduct. He will not step foot in this courthouse again until it is concluded. Daniels gave a small nod. See that it is done. Not for my sake, but for the integrity of this institution. One injustice tolerated becomes a license for many. The deputy marshal returned, reporting briskly, "He's been removed from the premises, sir." "Good," Daniel said simply. He straightened his jacket, collected his folder, and glanced once more around the room. Dozens of faces stared back, some ashamed, some emboldened, all altered by what they had witnessed. For a long moment, silence hung heavy. Then Daniel spoke, not as a man who had been humiliated, but as the voice of the law itself. Remember this day, not for the mistake made, but for the lesson learned. Authority without restraint is tyranny, and the law cannot bow to tyranny. With that, he turned and walked toward the courtroom doors, his steps calm, measured, unbroken. The same doors he had been dragged through in chains now opened before him with reverence. The crowd parted as he passed, a corridor of respect replacing the corridor of shame. The courthouse lobby was no longer the bustling, ordinary space Daniels had entered that morning. Now every eye followed him as he descended the marble steps, his folder tucked neatly under one arm. The same clerks who had scarcely glanced at him earlier now stood frozen, whispering as he passed. Reporters, always alert to rumors, had already gathered by the front doors. Cameras clicked, microphones thrust forward, questions tumbled over each other in a storm. "Chief Justice, is it true you were arrested inside the courthouse? Will there be charges against the officer? Sir, what message do you want the public to take from this incident?" Daniels raised a hand gently, and the crowd quieted, as though compelled by the very gravity of his gesture. His voice was calm, steady, unshaken. "There will be a time to address questions," he said, "but understand this. Today was not about me. It was about the law. And the law does not recognize uniforms or faces or prejudice. It recognizes truth. That is all I will say." Without another word, he moved past the reporters, stepping into the bright afternoon sun. The light struck his gray suit, his glasses flashing briefly, a figure both ordinary and extraordinary at once. Behind him, courthouse staff scrambled to restore order. Security officers, now twice as deferential, held doors open as he exited. Lawyers on the steps stood to the side, some bowing their heads in respect, others whispering his name, as though speaking it aloud might summon repercussions. Daniels crossed the plaza calmly, the sound of his footsteps steady against the stone. Not hurried, not triumphant, simply measured, as though walking away from one case to prepare for the next. For those who had witnessed the morning's humiliation, the image of him leaving free, dignified, unbowed, would linger longer than the officer's shouts. They would remember the sight of the man in cuffs and the shock when those cuffs fell away to reveal the Chief Justice. On the courthouse steps, a young lawyer, the same one Daniels had quietly guided during the hearing, stood among the crowd. His eyes followed Daniels until he vanished into the flow of the city beyond. For him, and for many others, the lesson was clear. The law's dignity did not come from robes or benches, but from the character of those who upheld it, even under fire. And as the doors of the courthouse closed behind, the day's proceedings resumed. But nothing inside those walls would ever feel quite the same again. So let me ask you this. Do you think that officer truly didn't know who he was dealing with? Or did he simply not care? And if you had been sitting in that courtroom watching the Chief Justice dragged away in handcuffs, would you have spoken up or stayed silent like most did? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed today's story, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and press the bell icon so you never miss the next one. And don't forget to share this video. It helps us reach more people with stories that matter. Our other videos should be appearing on your screen right now. Click on one of those and keep watching. I'll see you tomorrow, same time, with a brand new video.